Hey, what's going on, everybody? So in this video, I'm just going to do a quick overview of a question that keeps popping up in the Q&A section of Colt Steele's The Web Developer Bootcamp. And that is this situation that we're looking at here. We've got a function that is defined, and it's basically just mimicking an HTTP request, and it sends back a little string to the user letting them know whether or not the request worked. So basically, the user's going to try and go to a website, and if it takes too long to load, it's going to tell them that it timed out, it didn't work. And if it doesn't take too long to load, if it loads faster than 4 seconds, which is a super long time, but it'll tell you that it worked. You know, here's your fake data. So this is the definition of the function, and then this is the invocation of that function with some arguments. And so in the definition, we have a parameter here, URL, another parameter, success, another parameter, failure, right? So this function takes 3 arguments. And then when we invoke it, here's the first argument. It's a string, which is our fake URL. And then the second argument is a function, and the third argument is a function. They're both anonymous functions, and both of them take these arguments of response. Well, one's response and the other is error. And then they log them to the console. The latter prepends a string called error. So people are asking, like, I don't get it. Like, you have success and failure up here in this function definition, and then you're invoking them here. And when you invoke them, you're passing in a string, but then like why down here do these functions have arguments? And so basically what's happening here is in order for us to access this function and do something with it, we have to first give it a name in the function definition for the function that it was called within. So you're gonna hear the word function a lot. Let's try to like keep things on track. I know it's confusing, I'm sorry. So fake request callback, this is where we're invoking it. Okay, we're passing in the 3 arguments. We're saying execute, do what you're supposed to do. Up here, this is where we're like defining it, right? We're saying this is what it will do whenever you invoke it, which is what happens below. And so it will take a URL. It will take something called success, which we anticipate to be a function. And it will take something called failure, which we also anticipate to be a function. Now in this case, we're passing in anonymous functions. And to help us deal with the arguments that are passed in, right? Failure has an argument that automatically gets passed in when it gets invoked, and success has an argument that automatically gets passed in when it's invoked. In order for us to be able to deal with those, we have to have arguments here, okay? And so that's why we have response and error in these anonymous callbacks, because if we didn't, then we wouldn't be able to handle these strings. So here's an example of it working, right? You just run it, it takes however many seconds, it took less than 4 seconds or 400 milliseconds, and therefore it says here's your fake data. You can run it again, and honestly it'll probably just keep saying that same thing unless we get lucky and we get one that's greater than 4,000, in which case it'll tell us that there's an error. So what happens when you invoke this function, but you don't put response in there, right? Well, if you don't put response in there and you just run it, it's just going to tell you, gotta wait for the timer, that there's a reference error. Error is not defined. So in that case, it took longer than 4 seconds, so it went ahead and defaulted to, right? If it's greater than 4 seconds, we use failure, so it defaulted to failure. So it tried to invoke the second one as opposed to the first. It does one or the other, but not both. That's why we have the if-else here. So it did the second one, and it went to go log this ERR, which is it should have been what we passed in the function, because when we do this failure here, we're passing something in automatically, right? But we have nothing in place to handle it, so that's why we have those arguments there. That's why we have response, that's why we have error. So something else that you can do is you can actually define these functions beforehand to be able to handle this. So let's say that we have, instead of anonymous functions, we have some named functions. So we say function success, and then it's going to take this argument right here, the parameter, can be anything, right? It can be taco, it doesn't matter. But in this case, let's do something that's like makes sense, right? So the success is going to do something with an argument called message. And so we just console log the message. There we go. All right, so there's our success function, and then the same thing for error. So we say error, or in this case they called it failure, so that's fine. Now, mind you, these functions don't have to be called the same thing as they are up here. I'm calling them success and failure because it makes sense, right? Because that's what we're calling them as these parameters to the fake request callback. But you could call this taco, you could call this watermelon, it doesn't matter. So we'll do failure, also takes a message. Again, that parameter can be anything you want it to be, but just write something that makes sense. So then we put this thing that indicates that it's an error. You don't have to put that if you don't want to, but it's kind of helpful. And then we do message. So notice that here we're using the argument message and message as opposed to the original one, which was response and error. Doesn't matter what you use as long as they match up inside of the function when you call them. Okay, so now we have these two functions, one called success and one called failure. They do something very similar. They both just log to the console. In the real world, you would obviously do something more elaborate and differentiating than those two things. So we want to do this fake request callback, right? And so when we do fake request callback, we give it some URL. So in this case, there's, books page 1, blah, blah, blah. But instead of passing in the anonymous functions like we were doing previously, in this case, we can just pass in success, that's that function right here, and failure, okay? Now, because they're not anonymous, they're already written to handle the message argument. We don't have to put that in there. So we don't have to say failure and then some message or anything like that. You just put the name of the function, you run it, and now whenever it decides which one it wants based on the delay, and it runs that argument, whether it's success or failure, and it passes in that argument of the string, that argument gets handled because when we wrote those functions, we wrote them to expect or to anticipate an argument being passed in. We called it message, and then we dealt with it. All right? And so, again, if you were to invoke this, but your functions were not set up to handle an argument, then this fake request callback that you defined beforehand is just not going to work properly because it's expecting those callback functions that are being passed in as arguments to anticipate and handle one argument that is a string, okay? And that can be true for if you were to add multiple arguments. If it was going to add multiple arguments, whenever you define whether it's an anonymous function or it's a named function, whenever you define those functions, they would have to be written so that they anticipate the number of arguments that are expected of them in the other function that's calling them. So this stuff is pretty tricky. Hopefully this helped explain it a little bit and didn't confuse you even more. I know Fun Function, I don't know that he's doing videos anymore, but he's got a lot of content around higher order functions and using callbacks and things like that. So obviously I really hope this was helpful for you, but if it is still confusing, check out Fun Function's channel. He's got some great content there. Otherwise, thanks a lot. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.